A guten Erev Shabbos. There's a whole science, a whole discipline of sign making. We've all been in airports that make it very easy for travelers who are not from that place, which I guess by definition is all of us, otherwise what else are we doing in the airport, to find our way, to figure out where the baggage claim is, where to get a cab, and so on. Books full of graphic design projects exist. You can flip through them and analyze all the various ways that people who design signs and signage for a living have tried, sometimes with greater success, sometimes with less success, to help us navigate unfamiliar paths. It is a science, but science also has its fails. Thanks to the internet that has made us much better than ever at wasting time, you can Google sign fails and see where the wording or the graphic or the design or all the above were not so well thought out, and the result was some kind of sign that's either confusing or contradictory or hilarious or, let's say, inappropriate for kids. But good airport signage, clear highway signage when you're trying not to miss an exit or to merge onto a different route than the road when the road splits, can make a lot of difference in getting you where you are headed without too many unwanted detours. And speaking of detours, since we're in the construction season, you've probably had to decipher more than one of those annoying orange detour signs, more than you'd like. Sometimes don't even let you know where you're going once you're there. Another story. So these signs along the way, Simanim B'derech, in the name of a CD by an Israeli singer we used to listen to a lot in our house, they help you figure out where you're going. And what about figuring out where you've been? That is the topic of one small instruction that Moshe Rabbeinu gives at the beginning of this week's Parsha. Since we're coming up on the high holidays, and since the bulk of Parshas Ki Savo is taken up with the lengthy, detailed, very graphic curses that would be the lot of people who fail to follow the Torah, these topics often get top billing in conversation of Ki Savo. So just this once, let's take a little detour. Let's stop and smell the roses. Let's pull over and take the scenic route. Okay, I'm out of metaphors. And finally notice a mitzvah that's been right under our noses and right under our radar. Middle of the Parsha, fourth Aliyah. Moshe and the elders instruct the people. Moshe knows that he will not be with the people in the coming weeks as we cross the Jordan River into Israel. So he gathers the elders to be there with him, to be part of this instruction, because they're going to be taking over his responsibilities and leadership. And he says, it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan to the land that God your God gives you, avanim gedolos, you should set up great stones and coat them with plaster. Inscribe upon them all the words of this Torah when you cross over, so that you may enter the land that God gives you, and so on and so forth, flowing with milk and honey, etc. We're supposed to then build an altar there and bring offerings to Hashem, Ola offerings and peace offerings for God, and we're supposed to inscribe on these big stones that we've set up there all the words of the Torah, and it says Be'er Heitev, well clarified. Okay, then we get into the Bnei Yisrael and standing on two sides of the valley, Mount Gerizim, Mount Eval, and the Kohanim and the elders of the Levites in the middle. The curses are read out. The people have to answer Amen. It's a whole dramatic scene. But let's focus for a few minutes on those signs. Here we are crossing into the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering in the desert. And the first thing we're supposed to do is put up these signs. Now, these signs are a little bit different than what we spoke about before. They not only tell you where to go, they tell you where we have been. You have something similar to this once in a while. Not when you cross the border from Buffalo into Queenston or Fort Erie. It says, welcome to Ontario, yours to discover, or something like that. Going the other way, it says, welcome to New York, the Empire State. They tell you the governor, in case you need that information. But once in a while, if you use like a public tennis court, a public swimming pool, once in a while you'll find the whole Torah of tennis courts posted there. No black shoes, pick up your trash, proper attire required, no skateboards, no roller skates, no inline skates, no profanity, limit play to 1 hour if others are waiting. A whole list of instructions, a whole Torah of do's and don'ts for that place. So we are familiar with this concept at some level. So that's what the instruction, the one-time instruction, by the way, of these stones is to do. It's to have us put up a clear sign and put all of the Torah's instructions there for us. Now let's look just a little bit more deeply into what Moshe Rabbeinu is asking the Jewish people to do as we head into the land of Israel to conquer it, to dwell in it, and to settle it. The instruction to put up this sort of a Jewish Stonehenge is said at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 27, like we said, our parsha this week, and it's reiterated later in that same fourth aliyah. We were supposed to set up, according to the commentaries, 12 huge stones and engrave the entire Torah on them. It's later detailed in the book of Joshua that they in fact did this. But we're not clear on exactly what was to be engraved for a couple of reasons, or if the plaster covering was over the engraving or what. The Gemara in Tractate Sota says that the plaster covered over the writing. If you wanted to read it, you had to lift up this soft plaster protective covering if you wanted to see it. The last words in this instruction, in this whole set of directions here, Be'er Heitev, well clarified, let's call it, means, according to Ibn Ezra, that they have to be legible. You can't make them so small or so sloppy they can't be read. But that's not what most people think. Rashi quotes that same Gemara in Sota to say that they should be readily understood by anyone. What does that mean? The sages took it to mean that there has to be a translation of the Torah into all 70 languages that were common in the world at the time, engraved in each language. Now, if you imagine a bookshelf of 70 translations of the Bible, it would take up a lot of space, like a whole bookcase. 70 translations of the whole Torah engraved in stone would take a miracle, not to mention a whole lot of stones. So Reb Sadia Gaon had a good solution. He said, not the entire Torah, just the mitzvahs, just the 613 mitzvahs were translated and engraved. Okay, you can start to imagine that. If you make a long list, maybe you can fit that. Sounds a little bit more feasible. The Radatz, Reb David Zvi Hoffman, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, has an even better solution, even better time saver. He says the only thing that was actually written in 70 languages was one mitzvah, the prohibition against idolatry. That's what we needed to make sure that all the nations, all passers-by knew. Sort of a minimalist position in this controversy here. Looking still even deeper, the Maharal of Prague unpacks Rashi's wonderment that there might have been not only one set of Stonehenge, but three. It seems like there were actually only two, but you could understand that there might have been, one might read it to see three sets of stones, one outside of Israel, one inside. But the one inside of Israel was installed and then moved and reinstalled in a different place. The resolution is not entirely clear. Why, how. Barbanel also understands that there were three sets, one in Jordan, one in Gilgal, yet another one, Mount Eval. He also says that one set of the stones by the river were actually in the river. They were set up in the river itself, because it makes reference to the Kohanim and their feet. It says so that the Kohanim wouldn't have to stand in the mud of the riverbed, a little sidelight there. Oznayim LaTorah, the Lutzker Rav Zalman Saratskin, gives three reasons for setting up these stones. He says one is so that the world should know that the Jewish people came into the land of Israel not as foreign conquerors, but rather as inheritors of a land which was promised to us by God. Number one. Number two, when Avraham first came into the land, he came from Shechem to Elon Moreh. Repeating that journey and marking it with these stones quite literally puts us in the very footsteps of our ancestors, says the Lutzker Rav. And thirdly, we came to Shechem, which is the very place where God made this promise to Avraham. So it's a representation, a real, a geographical embodiment of the idea that inheriting the land depends on God's promise, which involves keeping the Torah, of course. Now let's come back to us. What has all this got to do with us? We weren't the ones who crossed in the river Jordan, over the river, through the river, into the woods, over the river into the promised land. Note that when the Torah instructs the Jews to build these stones, this is not one of the 613 mitzvahs that's obligatory for all of us in all times. It was specifically for that time and place. Then again, if we're learning it today, it has to resonate with us, teach us something somehow or other, some kind of lesson in life. The fact is, Moses' message should certainly still resonate with us and move us in a very profound way. Why are we still here? What is our persistence? What has inured us to the tides of history? not to mention so-called civilization after so-called civilization who put their best ingenuity and creativity into murdering us. Moshe would tell us, remember, it's because of the Torah that you're still here. God chose us, not because we're inherently better than anyone else, but the very fact of God's choosing us to receive His Torah, and in us choosing each generation to live out what it says in that Torah, that's Be'er Heitev. It's a very well-clarified explanation for our durability and longevity as a nation. So here we are in a very challenging time. Okay, maybe it's not Egyptian slavery, maybe it's not 40 years in the desert, but 6 months in lockdown is no small thing. And as ever, we have held on tightly to our tree of life. Like we always say, Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. Torah has helped us keep our values straight, kept our minds and hearts occupied with important things, and Shabbos has even kept our clock, our internal clock, true when the rest of the world was wondering what day it is. It's been a difficult journey so far, and it appears that we are nowhere near the end of it yet, but we maintain our hope and our trust and our faith and our connection one to another and to God, our source of life. Thanks to Torah, which lights the path before us and illuminates our eyes and our lives, we know who we are and what we can accomplish and why we are doing it. We're not conquerors, but we're inheritors and stewards of God's earth. We're supposed to tend it, we're supposed to use it for the very best purposes, and ideally to leave it maybe even a little bit better than we found it. We've come through a lot in our lives, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty and unaccustomed instability over the last half a year or so. This is not the first time, this is not the last time. But the engraving is in our hearts. We know, Be'er Heitev, with absolute clarity, what our direction and purpose should be. So now we're about to cross the river again. In 2 short weeks, we'll cross from 5,780 into the new year of 5,781. The clear direction, the Be'er Heitev of this portion of Tavo should guide us to conquer, to inhabit, and to settle ourselves in the new year, and to make the new year a sweet one, flowing with milk and honey as the land of Israel, and a healthy and good year for us and for the whole nation of Israel. Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova.